Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you're joining us to this event. My name is Shani Orgad, and I'm Professor of Media and Communications at the LSE. A very, very warm welcome to all of you to our online public event, in which today our speakers will discuss the new book, Parenting for a Digital Future: How Hopes and Fears About Technology Shape Children's Lives. And in this fantastic book, which I hope many of you, all of you will read or have read already, Sonia Livingstone and Alicia Bloom-Ross explore the relationship between parenting, the digital future, and show us how they've become a terrain for contestation and various struggles that I'm sure they'll speak about this afternoon or evening. The book draws on an extremely rich research with a range of parents in the UK that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is in fact proving ever more timely and extremely salient. So we have an hour and a half in which we will first hear from the book's authors, Sonia Livingstone and Alicia Bloom-Ross, followed by two responses from Paul Hodkinson and Lynn Schofield-Clark, whom I will introduce later. The panel will then have a short discussion before we open the floor to Q&A from you, our audience. Just to mention that this event is part of the LSE's series about shaping thoughts post and during COVID-19. So if you want, please use the hashtag LSE COVID-19 or alternatively hashtag P4DF, Parenting for Digital Future. So let's kick off by introducing our first speakers, the authors of this book. Sonia Livingstone is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications here at the LSE in the UK. She has published 20 books, including the most recent one before this current one, which is called The Class: Living and Learning in the Digital Age. And Alicia Bloom-Ross is a researcher, educator, and advocate who's worked in academia and industry, civil society, and she studies and creates supports opportunities for children, youth, and families to more safely connect, create, and learn online. And I should say that she's now the public policy lead for kids and families at Google. So without further ado, I'll invite Sonia to kick off with presenting us with this fantastic new book.
Shani, thank you so much. And let me add my welcome and my pleasure to be here. And I'm really delighted to have a chance to discuss the book. And I look forward to the responses of our respondents here on the Zoom and also those that are going to come in from the audience. So we begin this book with a vignette and it gives you a sense of our fieldwork. As we entered Lara and Pavel Mazur's small flat in a London suburb, Lara immediately began pouring out their disagreements about 6-year-old Thomas's digital activities, exclaiming how much she and Pavel had been looking forward to discussing this with us. Lara was a college administrator originally from Brazil, and she was really keen to enable Thomas's online opportunities, researching educational apps and seeking to build his confidence and make him independent online. Pavel, a chef from Poland, was worried about the risks, especially after Thomas's friend introduced him to a violent video game. Lara wanted Thomas to learn about the ways of the world, saying, "I talk to him about it when it's happening. I'm really open." Pavel had set everyone's passwords on the family laptop and said, yeah, we need to educate him how to use the internet so he can make the right choices, but you need to be safe at the same time. I don't want to control, but I just want to be able to view it in case there's something I'm not able to control. Again, Lara was excited. The school is introducing coding. Pavel is wary. I need to stay on top of it. I need to know what he's capable of doing on the computer before I let him loose. So I'm going to have to learn coding. Thomas, by the way, was well aware of his parents' differences, telling us his dad didn't always let him play his beloved FIFA game, but mum usually says yes. So how should parents manage their children's digital lives, and what should they expect of them? And why are these questions so contested within families, among policymakers, and in the media? All through our fieldwork, worried, enthusiastic, defensive, and sheer exhausted parents were wrestling with their parenting philosophy and their digital parenting practice. Some were consumed by this, others were less bothered, perhaps they had greater concerns elsewhere, or perhaps they'd managed somehow to sidestep the public anxiety about all things digital. As with Lara and Pavel, mothers and fathers often differed, and social class and ethnicity also differentiated the families that we talked to, not always predictably. This diversity matters because it complicates public and policy talk about digital technologies in family life, because often that talk assumes there's something singular about parents' responses, or indeed something flawed. So although parenting practices might seem mundane, social science is clear that parenthood is being profoundly renegotiated in our increasingly individualized societies, especially in the West. Many things that were once prescribed by traditional authorities, family, health, finance, education, social relations, lifestyle, all of these are becoming more a matter of choice, with individuals simultaneously empowered and burdened with new opportunities and risks. So we distinguish in our book the everyday actions of parents from, quote, parenting, a term that's actually only recently become popular in public everyday discourse. And as Ellie Lee and her colleagues observed in introducing the field of parenting culture studies 10 years ago, they said, what was once considered banal, relatively unimportant, the private routines of everyday life for children and family, meal times, sleeping, playing, reading, nursery rhymes, stories, all of these have become the subject of intense debate about the effects of parenting activities on the next generation and on society as a whole. So this discourse of parenting constructs a series of demanding tasks for parents in late modernity. It charges them with societal and political, as well as personal and moral obligations to parent well, all judged according to standards that parents have had rather little role in setting, but which they feel very keenly. Individual parents' choices have cumulative and collective consequences. And so, as Ulrich Beck and Elizabeth Beck-Gernsheim observe, society tries to manage these through what they call institutionalized individualism, or institutionalized individualization, the competitive sink or swim culture in which the responsibilities fall heavily and unequally on individuals at the same time as social and structural supports are contracting. So, for example, Lila, a single parent on a low income, had invested disproportionately in buying a computer to give her daughters the educational chances she never had. This adds to her existing financial worries, and she also worries about the new digital risks that she's let herself in for. For some things, she can call on Nareen, her engineer, who, though only 10, can fix the computer. But Lila's other problems run deeper. In Parenting for a Digital Future, we invited parents to look backward to their childhood to reflect on how they were parented, and then forward to their children's childhood, even perhaps to the adulthood that they're preparing them for, though understandably, few can really anticipate the world 20 years from now, and is often a kind of techno-dystopian science fiction that fills our imaginations. But parents are practical. And for many, the starting point was what one mother called the tsunami of devices entering the home. For this represents the most noticeable and seemingly controllable difference between their childhood and that of their children. So by marking the difference, digital technologies, we argue, have come to crystallize the anxieties and mark out a key terrain, sometimes a battlefield, for the endless negotiations of domestic life. They add to the long list of things that, as Beck-Gernsheim puts it, must be negotiated, planned, personally brought about. And they act as a lightning rod for contemporary contestations over values, identity, and responsibility. As we also found, they add new risks and opportunities into the mix. So think back to Lara and Pavel. Yes, they're arguing about technology, but they're also trying to negotiate their values and who they want Thomas to be. Do they want him to be creative and fearless, perhaps like Lara? Do they want him to be careful and safe, as Pavel does? In other words, digital parenting, quotes, is both a challenge in and of itself and a crucial means by which individuals and society explore pressing dilemmas about how to live, what constitutes well-being, and what good life to hope for. And as we've suggested, this double meaning of digital parenting comes about because today's ever greater investment in parenting occurs in an ever less predictable and less safe world. And this investment concerns everyone since, quotes, children are the future. So society turns the spotlight on parenting, partly because social science documents its importance, perhaps also because the other solutions to social ills aren't working so well. So it's no wonder that the combination of digital innovation bringing uncertainty and complexity and child rearing being so crucial in its consequences seems particularly explosive. In these often fraught debates, parents' voices are surprisingly little heard or taken seriously. And if they are, it's for what they know of their child's experiences and what they can tell of their child rather than of their own. So our book tries to listen to parents and traces how, for the digital world, as for all the other challenges facing them, the consequences are unequally distributed and parents are unequally resourced to meet them. So like many, Lila feels rather isolated, vulnerable to that steady stream of media headlines that exhorts parents to learn the latest skills, buy the latest gadget to keep up, and yet closely monitor their children to avoid risks online and limit time on, quotes, mindless activities like gaming and social media. Parents are somehow positioned in these discourses as both the cheerleaders and the police for their children's digital activities, creating some pretty contradictory demands in which many of the parents we talked to felt that they are kind of set up to fail. So Lena talked of the constant sense of being afloat on a sea of hysteria. But it must be said, not all our families were so anxious, and some relished the idea of the digital future. So for ethical hacker Danny, coding is the new Latin and geeks will inherit the earth. But more common was Pavel's fear of losing control, something we heard repeatedly in our fieldwork. So by marking that difference between the past, the present, and the future, digital technologies crystallize anxieties and mark out a key terrain, sometimes this a battlefield, as I said, for that endless negotiation of family life. Each act of parenting, or each act of digital parenting, has a kind of double meaning as an intervention in the present and an effort to bring about a particular future, even though, as we discovered, parents struggle to kind of name that future or the path to achieving it. What fascinates us is that multiple forces seem to be combining to name that future as a digital future. And what also fascinates us is the particular risks and opportunities that that brings and that we explore in the book. Thank you. I'm going to pass straight to Alicia.
And thank you, Sonia, and thank you everyone for being here. As a social psychologist and an anthropologist, we worked, together closely to understand how parents respond and create their own future imaginaries. And that's the central preoccupation of the book. Not just what those imaginaries are, but what consequences that they have in the present. And we met many parents trying to chart their own course in accordance with their values and preferences. Some had many sources of support and many had very little, and some faced very particular challenges. For some, digital technologies offered useful pathways, sometimes workarounds to their problems. For others, the challenges were far beyond anything that technology could provide a mitigation for. We've all heard the famous statement from Tolstoy that happy families are all alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. But actually, we found lots of sources of complexity, both in the anxious and in the happy families, in the families that were seemingly doing quite well to manage these debates, and those that were really racked with forms of insecurity and pressure, both around digital and far beyond. Ultimately, our findings do not really support the sort of growing popular media discourse that there's increasing isolation in families or alienation with parents and children supposedly plugged into their personal screens in all forms of the house to the exclusion of togetherness, discipline, or morality. But we do find a lot to support growing concerns around inequality, and we found often that the investment in educational technologies and resources do not erase enduring and ongoing socioeconomic differences, and in many respects, despite parents' hopes, often exacerbate them. So reflecting back on the experience of interviewing parents who had babies through to 18-year-olds, those who were living in multi-million pound homes in leafy North London and in social housing across London, we identified three distinct, what we call genres of digital parenting. And by genres, we mean clusters of practices that are made meaningful by particular values and beliefs that are not necessarily always conscious or coherent. So these genres are embrace, in which some parents at some times seek out digital technology for themselves or for their children to ease family life or to gain valued professional skills. Balance, in which parents try to, in some sense, hedge their bets by encouraging some digital practices, but not others, often ad hoc, weighing opportunities and risks, both salient in the present, but thinking towards the future. And resist, in which parents try to articulate their efforts as attempting, at least some of the time, to stem the seemingly unstoppable incursion of digital technology into family life. So as Sonia sort of discussed earlier with Lara and Pavel, Lara was eager in some sense to embrace the new digital opportunities, but was worried about the speed of innovation, while Pavel resisted before finding a reluctant balance, for he was also keen to use digital technology for his own purposes, for Tomas to Skype with his grandparents in Poland, to try to learn, his grandparents' native language, to be able to connect with them, for the family actually had no relatives in the UK where they were living. So each parent adjusted around the other and with their son in an unfolding dynamic that helped them over time accommodate to what they saw as inevitable. Lara described everything is permeated by media and computers, so there's no way to avoid it. Lara and Pavel were keen to share their digital doubts and conflicts, but their interview was also telling for what else it revealed to us. Yes, we came to speak with them about media and technology, but we heard so much more about their lives, how they were shaped by their individual migration from Brazil and Poland to the UK, how their work was insecure and sometimes fragile, that they had formed a kind of community with friends and families at the school, but this was often insecure and not something that they could rely on, that they had a lot of uncertainty in their life around what resources they could access. So our genres of embrace, balance, and resist, they do refer to culturally shared constellations of values, practices, and imaginaries, but they're not neat classifications of families. We don't talk about a particular parent being an embracer or a resistor. For often we saw it sometimes a parent might embrace and then another parent resist, or they may resist by morning and embrace by evening. And when they sought a different kind of balance for their family, they would bring a kind of anxiety or questioning to each of these decisions, constantly calibrating. Did I get it right? Will this pay off? And in some sense, these genres could sometimes be difficult or dangerous in some cases for parents. So embracing in some sense meant positioning oneself as ahead of the curve. So you may feel exposed. Am I doing the right thing by leaning into coding or giving my kid, unfettered access to screen time, acting before the sort of social norms and support are in place? Balancing, we say the word balance and you might think of a graceful yoga pose, but in fact, we often thought of balance as being really effortful. It's not a simple, straightforward compromise, but it requires this constant self-questioning and judgment and adjustment. Is this right? How can I tell? I think the metaphor we use in the book is like standing on a log. You're constantly having to kind of, move under the surface to keep things going. And resisting may also carry its own worries. does it mean more, missing out professionally or socially for children? Or that, you're going out on a limb by sort of not taking part in what many parents saw as a kind of a rising tide. So in these sense, everyday parenting actions are imbued with this great sense of consequence, causing parents to assume the responsibility for trying to make things better for their children, despite the fact that many of the great social shifts that contribute to their children's future insecurity are actually far beyond their control. And actually, COVID in many ways has highlighted this as well. We think we can, make choices around digital media in the home, and especially now with distance learning, but actually the great, social shifts around access to education, access to safe, ways of being in the world are far beyond what any individual family can or cannot control. So in this context, technology becomes both a threat to children's security and a promised route to ensuring it. To research the book, we explored the parenting practices and imaginaries of 70 plus families in London. So we spent, sort of did in-depth ethnographic interviews with 73 families, and then supported that by a quantitative survey of 2,000 parents across the UK. We recruited families who had babies up to 18-year-olds and who were highly diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, family composition, and ethnicity. But in addition to cross-cutting to sort of try to get as much of a diverse sample as possible, although as a qualitative sample, it wasn't sort of representative, we also sought out parents who had, for one reason or another, a particular interest in confronting the idea of the digital future. And so perhaps had distinctive purposes or a distinctive perspective. So we met parents in all methods, and for hopefully some students who may be watching, we have a pretty detailed appendix in terms of how we did our recruitment and how we did the research. But we hung out at parents' school parents' evenings. We met parents through children's centers, through parenting organizations, through after-school programs where their children were attending, and sometimes they were hanging out at loose ends, waiting for a friendly researcher to say hello. And we particularly prioritized digital media and learning opportunities, so code clubs, digital making programs, media arts, and beyond. We included particularly families with children with special educational needs and disabilities, both because they are relatively under-researched in this research area and generally in many ways excluded from a lot of the kind of wider, perhaps kind of normative discussions around parenting and technology, but also because we found that many of these parents, and we can talk a bit about particularly parents with children with autism spectrum, expressed a sort of heightened hopes and concerns around digital media and what it might offer their children. And some cases saw it as a much needed workaround or a sort of pathway for social and economic inclusion, but also raised particular kinds of concerns. As Sonia alluded to one of the families earlier, we found a number of families who we might describe as kind of self-proclaimed quote unquote geeks. And some parents who were kind of quite heavily involved in technology in their own lives. So parent bloggers who were, really kind of thinking about and expressing their parenting through technology use in their own lives. It's worth noting that many of our interviews were very emotional, and that we found that actually parents were really keen to discuss not only digital technology, but also their approach to parenting in general. And we left many of the interviews feeling, and actually indeed being told explicitly from parents, that actually they hadn't been asked these questions by almost anyone, or hadn't really felt that there were many sort of safe spaces to discuss these topics. We were also asked for advice quite a lot in interviews, which we, tried to, if we were going to give, at least give at the end of the interview. But in some ways, tried to shy away from giving too much advice. Although it was notable that we tried to point parents to other resources and noted, of course, in doing so, how few there are that speak to the full volume of parents' concerns. In some sense, we contrast the public discourse that problematically exhorts parents to police their children's screen time, acknowledging that actually parents are often trying to engage in what Anthony Giddens calls a more democratic mode of family life, which actually respects their children's interests in digital technologies. We also really resist and eschew the myth that parents are digitally ignorant, that they are quote unquote digital immigrants, whereas children are digital natives. Because actually many parents had their own interests in and hopes for digital technology, helping and use digital technologies to help themselves seek out new modes of parenting. And many families, in fact, were very focused on the shared pleasures of digital technology, whether that was simply watching TV together as a kind of space of togetherness, or playing games together, or indeed engaging in social media together. So this, what we found are many of the genres that we identified were not specific to any one socioeconomic class, but really involved and were instantiated by families across the social spectrum. We did actually, one of the interesting findings in our book, and this is particular perhaps to doing research in London or other kind of global cities that have a kind of strong presence of a very well educated but economically insecure, what we could call kind of creative class of parents. And we found that that was actually interesting in terms of problematizing some of the kind of neat divisions that we might try to have along class lines. We also looked at the role of educators, and particularly the educators in the non-formal learning spaces where we met some of our families. And one of the things that was quite notable was that the educators in those sites tended to view parents sort of at best as a kind of a neutral slate, and at worst as sort of actively deficient or kind of you sort of know nothings in some sense. And we were really struck by this kind of view from many of these educators that the children had kind of arrived at their site kind of from nowhere and were sort of going nowhere, not going nowhere in terms of their own lives, but they didn't really think about the other sites of their children's lives. So finally, we concluded really that parents seem to be very much caught in a kind of a pincer movement in late modernity. On the one hand, they are more burdened with responsibilities given the erosion of state support and an increasingly uncertain socioeconomic future. And then on the other, they're charged with respecting the agency of their child, helping their child increase their life chances. And there's therefore much to negotiate. So we argue finally that in seeking to manage the often fraught dilemmas of their lives, parents find themselves looking back to their own childhoods and forward to an imagined but really unanticipatable, often digital future. Through the generational stories that parents tell, often echoed and amplified by the public media discourses, digital technology truly do come to kind of crystallize parents' deeper hopes and fears. This leads parents to variously embrace, balance, or resist technology in ways that shape, both beneficially and problematically, both their family's present and their children's future.
Thank you very much, Alicia and Sonia, for this really enticing introduction into your book. I want now to introduce the two other speakers who will give their brief, relatively responses to the book, and we'll then have a short panel discussion before opening to the Q&A. We're already starting to get quite a lot of questions from the audience, so that's really exciting. But I want to first introduce Paul Hodkinson, who's a reader in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey. Thank you for being with us today. Paul's work is focused on youth culture, online communication, contemporary fatherhood, and the relationship between digital media, relationship, and well-being. And he has very recently published a book, also a new book called Sharing Care with Rachel Brooks, which looks at the experiences and perspectives of primary and equal care fathers. Our second speaker who will give her response is Lynn Schofield-Clark, who's a professor and chair of the Department of Media, Film and Journalism Studies and the director of the Esler International Center for Journalism and New Media at the University of Denver in the US. Lynn is an ethnographer who's studied and worked with diverse US families and young people for over more than 15 years. And she's interested in how the everyday uses of digital, mobile, and social media shape people's identities and aspirations, particularly in the context of widening income inequality in the US. So, Paul, if you want to start giving your response, followed by Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be able to be involved in this and to have an excuse to engage with a book that's as timely and important as it is engaging. There's so much I could discuss, but I'm short of time, so I'm going to pick out a few things that really sort of stuck out for me in reading this. The first one is something that was sort of already mentioned, just the depth and the richness of the fieldwork in the book. we've got sort of a rich, in-depth interviews with a very sort of impressively diverse sample, participant observation across a range of sites, and a very significant survey as well here. It's a wonderful example of what I sort of feel the urge to call, whether this is right or not, it feels sort of ethnographic to me. It feels like a sort of ethnography, and, you know, perhaps less an ethnography of media as such than of parents, families, and the institutions and discourses that surround them in relation to the digital, where very much the depth of that contextualization is a real highlight for me of the book. And in taking that focus, I suppose maybe the standout feature also was mentioned already. It's that it's so invaluable to have a book that's focused so extensively and deliberately on the perspective and experience of parents themselves, which is sort of less common than it might seem in this sort of area. And in doing that, it really does highlight just how challenging a position that many parents find themselves in. And that's something that sort of has come through in sort of various bits of my work as well. So it particularly chimed, I think. So the myriad and contradictory expectations, advice and discourse that parents are sort of having coming at them from all directions amidst this kind of climate of quite intense judgment. All this against a sort of background of sort of broader individualization, intensification of parenting that's been sort of discussed in sort of other places too. And amidst kind of cultures that I think it's fair to call cultures of parent blame. So parents being sort of regarded as technophobic, ignorant, passive, or alternatively from a different side as failing to protect their children from online harms of various kinds. And it's clear that this weighs very heavily on some of the parents in the book who worry intensely about the judgment of others, about the well-being of their kids, about opportunities, about futures, and about whether they're doing it all right or in the best way that they can. One thing that I sort of pondered about this, which is touched on a little in the book, is I suppose the extent to which such pressures are felt the same or differently by mothers as opposed to fathers, bearing in mind broader tendencies towards sort of gendered forms of sort of mother blame specifically, and sort of assumptions about mothers as sort of default carers, but also the location of technologies themselves in a realm that's often sort of dominated by men and boys, or at least is sort of thought of as such. So the book also sort of identifies very much how society kind of contributes to these burdens and sort of discusses how much society does or perhaps doesn't really offer that much to parents in the way of help. Outlining really that society is not really sort of managing always to give parents what they sort of really need. So there's a really interesting section, for example, on the connections between children's learning across different sites. So their children's learning in the home as opposed to school, as opposed to clubs and various other places, and the kind of lack of connections really, and sort of minimal kind of communications from schools and so on, which is sort of identified really as a sort of area that we could all sort of improve on potentially. And I think that's a nice example of how the book takes us deep into what's going on in the home, but also then connects that up so intricately with the world outside, tech camp schools, broader media discourse, etc., etc. Another sort of little question, I suppose, that sort of popped up again, which sort of comes up a little bit, is sort of what's the role of informal parent networks in all this? Do they sort of act as some sort of like an intermediate level between the family and broader institutions? And if they do, is this kind of, you know, do they sort of operate in sort of positive ways? Do they offer sort of collective decision making, sharing best practice, etc.? Or do they sort of act as a conduit for cultures of judgment of the kind that we've sort of that are sort of discussed in the book? So I've talked about some you know, challenging, somewhat negative things the book talks about, but another thing that really comes through is kind of how far most of these parents are from the stereotypes that we possibly sometimes hear about, and how admirably they negotiate the dilemmas, the advice, the judgment, the various other things that they're sort of contending with. So there's just this sort of rich picture of the sort of commitment and the nuance of families in terms of their approaches to these things, and that sort of goes across the income brackets and the sort of different kind of families that are talked about. It's perhaps particularly obvious in what are referred to as the geeky families, and also those where technology sort of become really sort of key to the approach in relation to kids with learning disabilities, but also in less obvious places too. And another thing here is the way the book highlights the fluidity and sort of contradictions often that are going on. There's constant change, there's constant dilemma, there's sort of a degree of fraughtness, even among families that are quite comfortable with various things. So even the most apparently committed of embracer ends up with doubts and resistance of various kinds. And even the most cautious apparent resistor is sort of acutely feeling this need to enable engagement skills and so on and so forth. And meanwhile, the book's sort of approach to inequalities sort of identifies quite sort of complex and nuanced similarities and differences between differently positioned families. And I guess my reading of this, for the most part, was the strong sense that there are quite sort of comparable anxieties, hopes, fears, and investments going on in at least in a number of cases, but that different resources, networks, and everything else mean that outcomes are liable to be substantially different, and that comes across very strongly. Winding up now, a couple more very brief points, as well as highlighting advice, dilemmas, pressures, and so much investment and negotiation. The book also rightly makes its own contribution to how engagement with technologies might be better negotiated. And a highlight here is the compelling rejection of watching the clock and that kind of approach in favor of more nuanced approaches centered upon the kind of differentiating really the content, context, connections that different forms of digital engagement involve. And this clearly is a sort of an essential and invaluable sort of insight. My only pause really sort of going forward, not so much in relation to the book itself, but in terms of what we all do going forward, is kind of how to effectively champion sort of more valuable, helpful approaches in various ways, without sort of unwittingly ourselves kind of ending up adding to the cycle of sort of parental anxiety and guilt, if that sort of makes sense. To be clear, I don't have an answer to this, I'm not sure. And the book's approach, in addition to so much else, is very admirable in that respect, I think. Okay, I had a couple more, but I think my time is up, so I'm going to leave it so there's plenty of time for discussion. Thank you.
Okay, and I guess Paul is kicking it over to me. And so again, I wanted to say thank you to Sonia and Alicia for writing such a wonderful and thought-provoking book. And thank you to those who've put this panel together. It is a real honor to be able to speak to this book. And I've really enjoyed it. I feel that it's made a really important contribution to our understandings of parenting and of the relationships between parenting and neoliberal society as they're playing out today. What I really liked, I think, are some of the same things that Paul had mentioned, that I really appreciated the depth and the thoughtfulness of the research methodology and its discussion of findings. The book is really impressive for its rigorous research design. As Alicia mentioned, they conducted interviews with close to 80 families and supplemented that with a very large-scale survey. But what's equally impressive is that they also dialogue with relevant scholarly conversations across the fields of media studies, sociology of the family, sociology of childhood, anthropology, studies of media and families, and education scholarship. And so this really becomes field-defining work. I think this is a book that can speak to dilemmas and conversations that are happening in a variety of different places and in various ways. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting to me as a person who has studied class in particular is the way that the authors discuss class categories in relation to multiply marginalized populations and in the context of London, where real estate has gotten egregiously expensive and where some nevertheless opt to live out their lives there in relative poverty or precarity in order to enjoy the city's multiculturally rich benefits. And I think this is something that London in some ways becomes a stand-in for many of our cities around the world that are experiencing the same kinds of pressures of gentrification that are colliding with this desire that all of us have for a good life for our children and for our families. And I think that the way that they talk about this helps us to contextualize some of the contradictory ideas that we have about mobility. We do tend to think of movement to the city as something that would help to amplify and allow people to move forward and move to a different socioeconomic position. And yet they emphasize that 1/3 of the people who move up in their study, also they found that about 1/3 of them moved down in economic position during the time of their study, which is consistent with some of the things that people have found sociologically on much broader realms of how we end up staying in about the same place for a lot of us. What I think is particularly intriguing is their suggestion that a common parenting culture has emerged that tends to echo middle-class norms of aspiration and competition. And that these families then that are discussed in the context of London are also discussed within the broader context of a shifting gig economy and contemporary neoliberal policies. And so I think that the common parenting culture that, of course, they talk about, that Sonia and Alicia both mentioned in this talk, is that they've referred to as the discourse of parenting, that then also brings attention to what is at stake with the consequences of bad parenting. And this focus is especially expressive of what they talk about in relation to institutionalized individualism. And in the US, I've also been struck by the rise of conversations that center parents and technology in relation to this discourse on parenting and stresses and concerns about our society overall, and how children then become stand-ins for our future, our collective future. Paul mentioned parental blaming as a big part of that common parenting culture. And in the US, I think of the language of parent shaming and how we see that, especially in social media. We have seen some extreme responses to the desire to control children. And often there is a discussion that takes place in social media that either shames parents for embracing technology too much or resisting technology too much. You can end up on either side of that shame game. And I think in the US context, for instance, of an example of a father who was so bothered by the way that his daughter was using social media that he actually pulled out his gun and shot his daughter's laptop, which is the kind of thing that would only happen in the US probably. But it does, what happened then was that it triggered a conversation that generated really polarizing responses about parenting and about technology. There was a shaming of him. How could anybody think that that was a good idea? But also in response, there were a lot of shaming responses on social media about parents who can't control their children. And I think what's interesting in this book, and I think what Sonia and Alicia really seem to be tracing, is a shift in how moral panics that were once attached to technologies and their development are now laid on individuals and as agents, so that it is parental behaviors rather than technologies that are at the center of the discourse about technologies, as they note. So the question then is, what are the implications of this for families and for society? And so I think what I'd like to invite Sonia and Alicia to say a little bit more about is their conclusion is that many parents seem to approach technology with a sense of hope rather than a sense of fear. And they do highlight some parental optimism in their findings. But I wonder if maybe resignation is a better term. In my work, I see a commonality that I wouldn't characterize necessarily as hopeful, because I think that this is true in what we find in many of the stories they tell as well. They're very hopeful for their children, and they embrace that hope and invest their children with a great deal of hope for the future. But parents, even the wealthier ones, seem to lack a sense of agency over technological infrastructures and a lack of interest in exploring the collective power that parents could have in shaping the technological infrastructures that in turn shape our lives. In the US context, for instance, we simply don't have a language for collective power when it comes to the technological platforms where young people spend most of their time. And I think that we see this reflected in the collective parenting discourse that Sonia and Alicia are tracing throughout their stories. Parents know their children are playing on Minecraft and sharing dances on TikTok and watching the posts of their older cousins on Instagram, on WhatsApp, and Kakao Talk. But are they following the news stories about Trump banning TikTok, for instance? Do they know that Instagram is even owned by Facebook and Zuckerberg? Or that Instagram stories are trying to win over TikTok posters? And even if they do know those things, do they think they have a role to play in how these technologies are making the decisions that influence the digital platform ecologies in which their children spend so much time? One of my own frustrations in writing the book, The Parent App, was in struggling to find the right tone and voice for the book. And I've talked with Sonia quite a bit about this, both when I was writing and when she was writing this book that you're now reading and we're talking about. Sonia and Alicia have chosen a scholarly, yes, accessible and friendly tone that is really consistent with the previous stellar research that they both have done and produced over the years that have been found valuable among educators and scholars and more recently parents. And as Paul notes, they have not written a book that is chock full of advice for middle-class parents, even though it is a book that has a lot of practical implications embedded within it as we're called upon as readers to consider the dilemmas that parents and that all of us really are confronting in our technological era. But the struggle over how to find a tone and voice speaks to a larger issue of the limits of our public imagination for the role of parenting in a neoliberal context. And I really appreciate that Sonia and Alicia have aimed to bring that context to light by pointing to the risk society as a context that shapes parenting, using Ulrich Beck's notion of the risk society as one that transfers risks from organizations that once offered some basic protections for human rights, like governance and corporations and education, to individuals who have to figure out for themselves what to do if they fall ill or get injured or are faced with discriminatory practices. And maybe that's not something that we want to hear or read about because we, and many of us who are reading this book are also parents, feel like we can't control those things. And so what we focus on is what we can control, how old our child needs to be when we get a cell phone, for instance, or how much time we should allow the children to spend on gaming sites, and who should be allowed to do what with which technologies before dinner or before homework. And must they finish their homework before they do anything else? So we scale parenting down to what happens in the household, acting as if our homes are isolated from the experiences of our neighbors. Well, maybe now that so many families are in lockdown in the UK and in the US and all around the world, we're finally realizing the folly of having a sense of any control. And that just got a lot tougher with schools having their children, with parents having to work from home and having their children in their home at the same time, saddling parents with the duties of both an always-on work at home communication technology facilitated environment and a parent-mediated always-on school from home communication technology facilitated environment. So parents are really on a crash course right now. And a lot of it has to do with what this book traces in relation to the struggle for control. I do think that ultimately they settled on a really practical and satisfying set of takeaways for their research, and they want to recognize that many parents are drawn to the democratizing trends in family life in which parents want to see their children take on agentive decision-making and build mutually respectful relationships. Those are the greater means of investing in things. And that's partly why we are seeing so much investing in things like coding camps, even as there are fewer resources available for the large number of under-resourced schools and communities, as they mentioned. The digital realm, as they trace in this book, is exacerbating familial inequalities, as the research points out. And so what I want to end with is just how much I appreciate the sense of empathy that they bring to the task of parenting, and the fact that their book as a whole is hopeful about how we can address ourselves as a society and as families to the demands that are placed on us right now and the sense of control, loss of control that many of us are struggling with. They talk in many ways about the need for patience and kindness for parents. And this is very consistent with Sonia and Alicia's long history of writing that centers children as agentive beings worthy of study on their own. I think they've contributed a wonderful and thought-provoking book that can help us as we think through it as families and as a society. What does it mean to be agentive when there are so many structures that are making us feel that we are less agentive than perhaps we have been in the past? And we need challenges as parents and as members of society to think about how we can come together collectively to identify the challenges we face and to find ways to imagine new possible futures for us all. So,
thank you very much, both Lynn and Paul. I want to invite Sonia and Alicia to give some brief responses. Obviously, you won't be able to respond to these, to kind of everything that was raised, which is really rich. I should say we also have had quite a lot of questions coming from our audience, with a lot of productive overlaps already around questions of gender and class, relationship between parents and couples. So hopefully some of the things you'll pick up in response to Paul and Lynn will also lead us to further follow this up with our questions from the audience. So Sonia and Alicia, whoever wants to take it first to respond first.
Shall I kick off and then Alicia will? So let's come in. So thank you both very much. I'm actually a bit overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness that and care and indeed empathy that you've put into writing these and thinking about these remarks in response to our book. So I'm really grateful, and there is indeed much more to think about in what you said than we can possibly do here. So I'll just pick up a couple of points. And I'm going to start with something that Paul said about how our chapter about learning kind of trace the disconnections between families at home and learning in various kinds of school, but also other learning centres, because it allows me to say something I should have said at the outset, which is that this work was done as part of the Connected Learning Research Network, where the idea, if you like, is the network is led by Itsuka Ito in Irvine, California. So the idea is that, yes, this is a very individualized age, and yes, in many ways, parents or people are separated, disconnected, alienated in some ways. But if we trace the connections, if we kind of think about designing environments better to support those connections, and if especially the digital can build better connections, then that would be, you know, one way forward. It's not going to overcome the horrors of the neoliberal society that Lynn mentioned, but it would be one way forward. And so we were very much looking for those connections, and it was perhaps one of the surprises of the book and of the field work, how much in looking for connections we found disconnections. And it kind of began almost as a response in the field work, that we would keep coming away and saying, oh dear, this person cried in the interview, or they felt so alone, or they didn't, you know, we'd hoped that they would have this kind of, it seemed like a nice community, but actually they were isolated within it. And a lot of the professionals that we'd hope people would kind of reach out and support people, very often, obviously, educators. You know, it's not that they were ill-thinking or kind of unfeeling, but they were in their own structures. They were in their kind of separate place and separate ethos. And for them, parents were very far away, and often described as somehow hard to reach, and kind of, because parents are all individual, and from the point of view of a school or a learning site, everything is kind of coordinated. It's like water running through your fingers, you know, you kind of can't get hold of the parents. And so somewhere within that, this deficit theory of parents seemed to live, but, you know, not to, we really had a lot of empathy also for the struggles that the educators had in kind of trying to reach out and trying to build something that was often very, very carefully thought through and developed positively. So connections and disconnections is also the link to my previous book that Shani kindly mentioned. I've become a bit obsessed by how the digital world promises us so many connections and delivers so many new kinds of disconnections and reconfigured disconnections. And it maybe is that, and I'll only make this one more point, maybe it's that gives us this astonishing sense of lack of control, that somehow we feel that we've got these tools that should connect us better. That was the promise, and that's why parents have filled their homes with them, and why society's investing. And yet the reality is that the kind of the the inequalities and the social structures that social scientists have studied for generations somehow end up reimposing themselves in this new space. So parents in some ways do stay optimistic, to Lynn's point. But resignation, yes, we saw resignation, we saw fatalism. We had some fantastic conversations with people about the kind of the surveillance capitalism that Shoshana Zuboff has since written about, not only from, you know, informed middle-class parents. I think a lot of people have that sense that, yeah, we sought connection and control, and we've kind of been delivered the opposite. So that's not a very optimistic note to end on. Is it maybe just a point to my colleague Amanda Third's book, which also came out recently, on young people in a digital society, which she calls Control Shift. And she says, we have to complicate and nuance our analysis. We cannot always seek control as if we are individual agents separated from everyone else, just grabbing our own kind of, exercising our own control. So control is a bit of a fantasy.
I want to pick up the gender point, I think that you raised, Paul, and I think there's been some questions about as well. And then I also think there was a couple interesting crossover theme between your two comments, which also want to echo Sonia's appreciation. I think it's really thoughtful, and thank you so much for engaging so deeply and kind of holistically with the book. So on the gender point, I think one of the survey findings actually was interesting. I think it was in our second survey report. We sort of cross-cut some of the analysis by gender and found that whilst fathers expressed more concerns about things like safety and privacy, they took less protective action. So whereas mothers describe themselves often as being sort of like not unconcerned, but less concerned about some of the same issues, they were sort of more active in shaping not the sort of general conditions of their children's media use, but actually the specifics of it. So like helping them set up a new account, like helping them, you know, I think we have a kind of a number of measures of actions that parents took in the survey. So that was sort of interesting that, you know, that like actions or sort of actions and beliefs don't necessarily always match up. I think a couple interesting points on gender in the book is that we did have a lot of parents who, when we kind of did the exercise of looking back at their own childhoods and then thinking about the children's present, really described kind of a more expansive sense of possibility, irrespective of gender, as being like something that they found their children was really hopeful in their experience of their children. And actually in the final chapter, we talk about a family that was a two-mom family. And one of the mothers who was sort of taking, you know, more parenting responsibility, really talked about how, you know, when she had been a child, that she felt like she wanted to do these activities like wood shop in school, et cetera, and had been told, you know, that she couldn't participate. And so she had like signed her daughter up to be a digital leader at school, and the daughter was like doing robotic, and they weren't a super high income family. And in fact, I think they kind of fall into that kind of creative class of families that we alluded to earlier, but that you know, that she really sort of saw her daughter as kind of inhabiting this world that she was sort of like consciously trying to help her have the tools to kind of negotiate, not irrespective of gender, but like in a more kind of expansive way of navigating. So I thought that was, you know, kind of quite interesting. And we did, you know, in a few cases, you know, we would visit these classes and they would be like 80% boys. And then we would try to sort of make a particular effort to talk to the girls that were there, who are often like very uninterested in remarking on the fact that they were the only girls there, you know, were sort of like got their head down, you know, sort of like got on with the work. But it is an interesting theme. Just to come to the second point about kind of parenting kind of as a collective that I think you both raised, both in the context, I think in Paul's comments about, you know, whether or not parents sort of seek solidarity and kind of support from one another. And I think, Lynn, you also kind of framed it in terms of like collective action. you know, I'll start this off, and Sonia, I'll hand to you if you've got some further thoughts as well, but just a few observations. I mean, one, you know, and you both kind of referenced sort of judgment and shaming. I think our overall impression was that parents weren't necessarily turning to each other, particularly for sources of advice and support, largely because they found other parents to be quite judgmental. So, you know, I think Sonia referenced the quote, you know, from one of the mothers who like described herself, you know, in the school playgrounds, and the quote was, you know, afloat on a sea of hysteria. That's a sort of extreme version of that, but actually many other parents didn't really, you know, talk to other parents for positive recommendations, like this has been a really fun or great thing for our children to engage in. Mostly they seem to feel that other parents had somehow gotten this more under control than they had, and therefore they were deficient in a way that they didn't necessarily want to reveal, that they, you know, that any positive like recommendations or things that they had found successful, they had sort of stumbled their way to, despite like anyone's particular recommendations. And it didn't seem apparent to us that they were sharing any of those positive experiences with anyone else. So that was, I think, really, really noticeable. On the kind of collective action front, I mean, I think in some sense I've sort of already alluded to the fact that there wasn't necessarily a collective to engage in collective action. Is that something that I think could be a powerful route for parents to explore? Yes, but I think that that distinction between judgment and the actual messiness of family life would sort of need to, in some sense, be overcome for that to be a kind of a transformative, you know, power in some sense. And I think our book was sort of an effort to do that, because we felt that we had been given this great honor to get to sit in so many families' houses and sort of like absorb. And we noticed actually between the two of us that we would ask the same questions in many interviews. I mean, not necessarily precisely because they were semi-structured interviews, but similar questions. And one parent would think that we were judging them for being too strict. The next, we'd ask the same question and the next parent would say, oh, you think I'm way too, you know, relaxed. And so we really sort of realized, you know, how much even trying to have a pretty neutral approach to these questions still was this kind of blank canvas on which parents would kind of castigate themselves for many different reasons. But Sonia, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that kind of collective question. I think it's a really good one.
My head is now going in many different directions, but I was also just kind of quickly looking at the Q&A, and I don't know how we're doing for time. Maybe we should.
Yes, I think we do. So I think we'll follow up, and also there's lots of interesting overlap. So I tried to cluster some of the questions we received. I should say also that except for questions, there's lots of just congratulations and embracing responses that are very enthusiastic about the book from people who have already either read it already or have just purchased it or on the way to purchase it. So to follow up on gender, we've received quite a few questions around the ways in which what you found, and particularly the three genres, and how do they map onto not just gender, but also race, class, and other sociodemographic differences. So maybe you can address this. And a related question was also how these genres map onto dynamics within couples, either heterosexual couples or other forms of family, including also single parents. So that's kind of quite a few questions around this. I'll maybe present a few questions and then hand over to you. And the second question, a lot of questions about the role of media industries, particularly the digital industries in parenting. What is your conclusion, advice, recommendations? But also even a more general question of where should parents turn to? Whose responsibility is it to support parents? Because, you know, it's very clear that you're suggesting that some forms of supports are needed here. So people are asking, should we look to schools, to the government, to professionals, to psychologists, and so on. And then another group of questions specifically actually about the perspective of children and all of this. So how do children themselves respond to the ways their parents negotiate or perhaps fail to negotiate digital parenting? But also how, if you have insight into how these genres that you mapped out support children differently. So in a way, inviting you to go back to think about the children and the impact of all of this on children. I might introduce another set of questions, but I'll let you perhaps pick on these, and also invite Lynn and Paul, because some of the questions have been also addressed to you, especially around class, gender, inequality, and the ways in which these issues relate and map onto them. The floor is open to questions, to answers. Sonia, you wanna?
Okay, well, I'll all great questions, and I was, yes, keeping an eye on the Q&A, so wanting to kind of jump in all the way through, but I've held back. Okay, so let me think a little about those three genres of embrace, balance, and resist. There was a moment in the fieldwork where I can remember telling someone, they said, what are you finding so far? And I said, the parents are just all so different. They're all so different. We're never going to be able to write this book because it's just too diverse. And so we had a bit of a nitty-gritty meeting, and we said, okay, let's think again. And after some work, we came up with these three genres, and then we kind of tested it against the fieldwork and thought more about it. One of the reasons I like the genres is, as Alicia said, they are genres of practice, not of parents. And we saw them kind of moving across people who were differently positioned in different ways. So that they kind of aren't clearly, you know, one favored by men and one by women, or one by middle class and one by poor folk, or whatever. So, but there were many, especially there were many different kinds of balancing. And you could, you know, we tried to illustrate those a little in the families we talked about here, and a lot more in the book. I suppose there are two kinds of patterns that we might nonetheless point out. I think we have a whole chapter about the geeky families, and those are sometimes geeky, self-proclaimed, kind of, or more tech savvy, embracing parents. Sometimes they're the children of those parents, of other parents, and the children are loving the tech and the parents are really kind of puzzled. So there were a lot of tensions in and around embracing technologies, because it wasn't necessarily that everyone was kind of trying to respond to the digital in the same way, but probably they were more middle class. And it does take a lot of resources to really kind of, you know, have the latest gaming computer and kind of, you know, get into some of those one of the digital camps we studied was very expensive, and we kind of interviewed several families from there. So embracing perhaps illustrates, and geekiness kind of illustrates the class nature of society's appeal to parents, to families, to kind of get on board with the digital future. That it's a, whereas so, but I don't know that I could say that balancing or resisting. I'm going to let Alicia have a further think about that, and maybe Lynn and Paul saw some patterns there. I did want to say something about how children respond to the different genres of their parents. So I think we saw, and we did see a number of different patterns. So we had some very kind of geeky, maybe blogging parents who were nonetheless quite kind of restrictive and controlling of how their children could engage with technology, and didn't necessarily share their enthusiasm for the technology with their children, which, you know, potentially could have been a connection between them, but parents kind of drew a line. Some of the kind of more tech savvy embracing children, there was a kind of a desire, I think, for their parents to engage more and kind of join them in this enterprise. But it didn't always happen. But we do know, of course, from a lot of research on parental mediation, going back, you know, many works, including Lynn's own book, that if parents are restrictive, if they are resisting something that is important to the child and kind of part of how they see their peer culture or their future, then that gives rise to difficulties and makes children kind of evade or find workarounds from what their parents are trying to do. Some parents resisted in ways that were very kind of articulated and explained to the children, and then that was understood. But if they did it in ways that was their decision, not shared with the child, not part of a conversation, then it generates a kind of an evasion or a resistance on the child's own part. Which is why, you know, at a certain point we really found Anthony Giddens' idea of the effort towards a democratic family kind of offered us a larger framing for some of those quite kind of niche and individual findings about parental mediation, and kind of put them in that bigger context.
I'll just add a couple words on the class point, but particularly Lynn, but I'm sure both of you have some thoughts on this as well. You know, we started one of the chapters by kind of comparing two families who both had sons who were very kind of digitally enthusiastic, and both of whom were learning to code. But we sort of drew, and so that kind of headline was shared, but the way in which that was being gone about was extremely different. So one family was this like extremely wealthy family in London who'd signed the son up for a kind of Python class at like a pretty, it was a relatively expensive summer camp where it was like an intensive camp at a prestigious London university. And he, you know, had brought his personal laptop to the class, which had then been loaded with the software so he could kind of continue to work on it at home. Whereas the other boy, you know, was a sort of single mother. She had migrated from West Africa, was living in social housing, and was enrolled in the after school kind of Scratch club at a sort of relatively low income school in South London, where they were, you know, using the free Scratch interface. And the club lasted a term because there was a long waiting list and they needed to make space, you know, for other students. And when we visited the family at home, there were like many digital devices in the house actually, but most of them had been sort of like low cost purchases. Many of them were broken. And the mother had never kind of seen the son's creations because the school like didn't allow them to use the public facing Scratch kind of social network, like kind of display site, you know, for kind of safety reasons. And therefore the mom didn't know how to log in to the, you know, password of the IT, you know, etc. So you can kind of see where like, while the headline and the aspirations are actually relatively similar between these two families, the way of bringing about the digital future that might confer advantage on those sons was very different, and the parents' own abilities and time. And I think there was also the kind of question about single parents. Of course, this is a mother who was working, you know, actually she was a cashier in a grocery store. She, you know, did not have a lot of sort of time. She had 3 children, did not have a lot of time to kind of spend, you know, time figuring out the login from the school, etc. So while her intention and sort of, in a way, the way she described her aspiration was actually very similar in some sense to the mother in the other family, although the language that she used to describe it was different. The way in which they were going to bring about this digital future for their son, with the 2 sons, was, you know, very, very distinct, you know, in our minds. And I think, Lynn, you said that kind of well earlier, that the hopes and the problems are similar, but the kind of effects of them are very different by class. So that's kind of one thought there. I'm sure others have thoughts on that point also.
Great. I wonder maybe if I'll introduce some more groups of questions, but maybe we can also come back, maybe from Paul or Lynn, any thoughts having read the book, but also from your own research, to the question of who should support parents? Yeah, whose responsibility, but also capacity. Who should we look to support parents in this realm? There were a few other questions that very much follow on the expansive way that you think about parenting in the book, asking about grandparents, for instance, but also about siblings and their role in digital parenting. If one of you might want to address that. And perhaps we have another 15 minutes. I think it might be appropriate to end on inviting all of our speakers to reflect on quite a few questions that came unsurprisingly around COVID and whether the pandemic at the moment, what kind of, Ellie Lee, whose work, Sonia, you mentioned, raised it, but also others, what kind of new layers has the pandemic presented to the contradictions that you've identified and the struggle you've identified, or are these the same contradiction and it's just amplified and pronounced? So maybe we can take first the questions, if Paul and Lynn want to come in on the question of responsibility, both of the media, digital industries, or other bodies, and then Alicia and Sonia both on the kind of role of grandparents, siblings, and other maybe, you know, carers in digital parenting and the pandemic. Lynn.
Oh, should I say? Okay, thank you. So thank you for the comments and the questions. So the question of who should support parents, I guess I would start with just one thing that was making me think of was some ethnographic work that I was doing this summer with young people in economically precarious neighborhoods. And it was very clear that in many of those families, the female children were needing to do childcare so the parents could work in economically and health-related precarious situations. And so in those families, often tech was used as a way to balance in the sense that parents were needing to be distant, just like Maddie and Miller's work in terms of the migrant parents that are between different settings. I was seeing that as well, that the parents wanted to stay in touch with their children and their family and would check in during the day when they were working. And the children, the young female children who were doing the childcare were the ones who were bearing the responsibility of doing that kind of negotiating that was going on. So I think it is very much a case that we are seeing more of a heightened stress of what has happened before in terms of the inequities of society. And it's actually surprisingly and unpleasantly easy for us to not see those things. For us, meaning me as a scholar, as a person from a middle-class background, to not see the kinds of inequities that are and how they're being experienced in people's lives. And I think that speaks to the way that we need not only media companies to respond, but we have to think about how we want our governments to respond as well, and to think about the financial and the economic inequities that are in place that need to be addressed, in part because of automation and other larger trends that are pushing people into such various disparate economic positions. And I think in terms of the media, the piece of it, the media, I guess, that it fits with for me is that we know that who is benefiting the most right now from COVID and from the pandemic and from a lot of things related to the unrest are Amazon, Google, the large tech companies that are able to, that we need now more than ever to connect us and to deliver our groceries or whatever it is that we need for our goods. And so I think that it is really high time for us to think about some of the proposals, like the one that seemed really extreme probably 10 years ago by Jaron Lanier, who said that we should think about micropayments, that a company like Google could make micropayments so that whenever our value as a product is extracted and put into circulation, and that benefits then a company like Google or Amazon, that there should be some kind of a micropayment back. So at the very least, we would understand as a society that there is a commercial transaction that's going on and that we are a part of, and that we then need to rethink how we're arranging relationships, that these are not simply companies that are delivering goods to us, but we're the product, as you know, as is often said, and as I would say Dallas Smythe first said in the 1970s. So let me turn it over to Paul.
Thanks. I'll just be brief so that there can be time for more from Alicia and Sonia. Such a difficult question, and you know that the answer is obviously sort of complex and multiple. The thing that comes through from the book, if I focus on that most strongly to me, is I suppose the role of schools and finding ways for schools. I suppose partly to have the resource to do more in the first place. Themselves, but secondly, what Sonia and Alicia draw so much attention to, which is the way that schools themselves communicate with parents. And I think you point out that schools do actually communicate with parents on a great many different things. And they also communicate with them about technologies. It's just that that communication tends to be sort of restricted to that kind of, you know, here's a set of guidelines about protecting your children, which may have its place, but clearly is sort of quite limited. So I suppose if I'm thinking about the book, the thing that comes through most of all is probably the role of education. But of course, there's so much else too. I suppose the other thing I'd add is it's partly about things that could be made available in a positive sense, but it's also about maybe all of us trying to refrain from the temptation to blame parents for things, and to sort of throw sometimes, you know, very well meaning but sort of idealistic advice at them from all different directions, which sometimes can make matters worse. So all of us trying to sort of, I suppose, to be practical in thinking about what parents are sort of encountering and what they're dealing with, and so whether it's media, sometimes it comes from academia, of course, you know, that sort of you know, it enables sort of particular issues to suddenly become a thing that we blame parents for. So maybe there are things that we could all sort of try and refrain from doing a little bit as well.
I mean, if I think that's absolutely right. I think parents often turn to the school and hope that the school is going, you know, that is their trusted local organisation with whom they already have the connection. I know that schools feel that they already have plenty of burdens without taking on digital parenting at home. It has been COVID-19, I think, that has really forced a recognition that somebody has to take this responsibility, and schools are appropriately placed in that they are now more than ever asking parents to invest in technology and kind of equip the home as a learning environment. But even though the book was done before COVID, we saw a number of parents who were kind of fitting out the home as that supportive learning environment. That only made it all the more poignant that the school didn't necessarily kind of recognize that fact. I mean, the other place that parents want to turn is their own parents, thinking about the kind of potential of grandparents. And one of the findings we found really fascinating from our survey was how parents did say that they would turn to their parents for advice about how their children are sleeping or learning or eating or whatever, but they couldn't for this. You know, this is one of those, this is a key issue in which their parents are not there for them in the same way, though not all parents are there for them at all. I want to link, I think beyond that, parents honestly don't know. And that is where there is a fatalism. They feel that they have been, they're in this new world that is complex and demanding and changing all the time. And the pace of change is particularly challenging. And they honestly don't know where to turn and who even they should hold responsible. So one answer that we do make in the last section of the book is that the media industry, as somebody pointed out, clearly is one of, in fact, a really crucial stakeholder, and has the potential to design the digital world in ways that reach out more to parents, that make their offer more communicable and understandable to parents. You know, part of not understanding how to control the technology is the design and nature of that offer that is in many ways uncontrollable and difficult. But just thinking about parent shaming, one of the images that was very salient to me in writing the book, it's a bit pre-COVID now, was a story that was very popular in the last year, perhaps, of people looking at parents at a cafe and saying, oh my goodness, do you see how they're just letting their kid on the phone? No one's got anything to say to anyone anymore. How can they let that little baby in the pram, you know, whoever, that kind of casual conversation that judges. And that's where I think our kind of two-level argument comes in, because we can think about whether it's whether it's really helpful for a small child to spend a lot of time on a phone, or what it means that a family is all sitting at the table together eating, but all on their phone. But the answers are not really about the phone. The answers are about the struggles that those families have, the lack of viable alternatives that they have, the fact that they might, you know, that moment of the child in the cafe might be their parents' first moment of peace from whatever difficulties they're kind of struggling with. So there is a kind of middle class gaze that says people should always be doing creative artworks and talking to each other constantly, and, you know, engaging in civilized activities. Parents are tired and they are pressured and they lack resources, and the technology industries could help more, but they didn't cause those problems. And that's why we're also trying to kind of point to the deeper issues that I think really apply.
I know we're nearly at time, so I'll offer kind of a few thoughts just to add to that. I mean, one is a slightly hopeful thing about COVID is that many schools now have created, you know, a family engagement post, right? And that is because they need, you know, there needs to be someone to like deal with parent like calls, and, you know, teachers obviously are busy with actually kind of the sort of day-to-day business of distance learning, which of course they were not anticipating having to do. And actually, you know, family engagement roles like should have been there probably all along in schools, but like maybe the hopeful thing is that they will be somewhat of a positive legacy from this period of time. And I think just to highlight a point that Sonia made, you know, that families were doing a lot of learning support at home, and that they were investing sometimes heavily disproportionately in comparison to their income and available time in doing that, I think was a sort of invisible given for many educators and for many parts of society kind of prior to the pandemic, and that this is now so visible that children's homes are literally visible in some cases in a way that they weren't before is hopefully something that, you know, if and when this whole nightmarish experience concludes, that, you know, maybe a sort of a positive legacy from this. I think also just thinking more broadly about COVID, I think there's one of the arguments that we make in the book is that, you know, things like the old and now outdated American Academy of Pediatrics screen time guidelines, you know, the no screen time before 2 and only 2 hours a day above, which is of course actually since been revised by the AAP, and many other health authorities have kind of a much more nuanced recommendations in recent years particularly. But yet that's still actually a touchstone for many parents, is kind of referring to that, although they often have no idea where those recommendations came from. But this sort of like throwing out the window of the screen time clock in some sense during COVID, and the recognition that like my kid is connecting with their relatives, with their friends. It's like this, you know, digital media is their only lifeline, that I'm using this for work in all kinds of ways, that we also are having fun and relaxing and, you know, kind of taking a beat at the end of the day. In some sense, obviously, we hope that we'll all be spending far less time, you know, using digital technology at the end of this, but that sense of contextual comparison, and that this is a sort of a set of tools which can be helpful or harmful, that can be used, you know, to support social connections or to get in the way of them. I think that is hopefully maybe putting to rest some of that kind of absolute time watching type advice that I think we all know, and certainly was very abundantly clear in our book, was that was a rod for parents to beat themselves with, but not actually to make much use of. And so I hope that this period of time, like in some sense, will kind of loosen the grip of some of that kind of more limited and kind of formulaic advice.
Fantastic. I think our time is almost up, and we've had 2 or 3 questions about the film that I think is on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, which we won't have time, but I think what our discussion has shown, and the book is showing very well, that the social dilemmas in the plural are much more complex perhaps than those that are depicted in this film. Thank you very much, Sonia Livingston, Alicia Bloom-Ross, Paul Hodkinson, and Lynn Schofield-Clark, and our audience for engaging. And I hope we all, and you all get to read this fantastic book and that we have other opportunities to carry on this fundamental and vital and most timely conversation.